"Jane, you've been living in a lie," Emily said, smiling too brightly, holding a stack of papers as if they were trivial notes rather than evidence of betrayal. Jane froze, her hands resting on the edge of the kitchen counter, watching her daughter-in-law with a calm that belied the storm inside. She remembered every careful choice she had made over the years, balancing budgets, cooking dinners, keeping the house warm, making sure her son Mark never wanted for anything. And now, in this quiet suburban kitchen, she realized how thin the veil of family harmony had become. The morning sunlight filtered through the half-open blinds, casting stripes across the tiled floor, highlighting crumbs from the breakfast she had prepared hours ago, now untouched. Jane's eyes scanned the living room where her carefully arranged family photos stood, a silent testimony to decades of love, effort, and devotion. The email she had noticed earlier this week replayed in her mind, lines of text that didn't add up, transactions that seemed to vanish into thin air, and the subtle shifts in Emily's tone whenever money or household decisions came up. She thought of the late evenings she had spent balancing checkbooks, of the weekends spent painting walls and polishing floors, of the quiet moments when she had tucked Mark in, whispering advice that he would now share with no one but his wife. And yet, here she stood, calm, almost serene, feeling the weight of betrayal settle like a shadow on her shoulders. Jane drew a slow breath, letting her senses catalog every detail. The sound of the refrigerator humming, the faint scent of coffee in the air, the distant hum of traffic outside, and allowed herself a moment to observe without judgment. Emily moved with deliberate casualness, arranging papers on the counter as though Jane's presence was irrelevant, speaking softly into her phone, glancing occasionally at Jane with a look meant to reassure, but failing entirely. Jane's mind traced back to the past month, the subtle shifts, the whispered conversations she had overheard, the carefully staged smiles at family gatherings, and the tiny but deliberate changes in household routines. She remembered the small inconsistencies, the slightly altered bill payments, the missing receipts, the explanations that didn't quite add up. A calm determination began to form, not born of anger, but of clarity. Jane didn't need to shout, didn't need to confront immediately. She simply needed to watch, to collect, to let the natural progression of truth unfold. Her hand brushed the edge of a photo frame, a snapshot of Mark as a boy, holding a baseball glove, smiling up at her. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of her own patience, of her own enduring strength. Emily's eyes flicked to Jane, sensing perhaps some change, but not understanding its depth. The air was thick with unspoken tension, yet Jane remained still, her gaze steady, her posture unshaken, the quiet center in a room filled with pretense and deceit. She walked slowly toward the living room, each step deliberate, noticing the sunlight catching on a crystal vase, the subtle dust motes drifting lazily in the golden light, and for the first time, Jane felt fully in control of the situation. She would wait, she would observe, she would gather the threads of truth carefully, and when the moment came, every carefully hidden detail would reveal itself. Until then, she would stand calm, composed, and unflinching, the silent architect of her own reckoning. The rest of that afternoon passed in an uneasy silence. Emily stayed busy in the kitchen, opening cabinets, checking her phone, and moving from room to room with the confidence of someone who believed she controlled the rhythm of the house. Jane sat in her favorite armchair near the front window and watched the neighborhood through the lace curtains. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. A delivery truck stopped across the street. A golden retriever pulled its owner down the block with enthusiastic determination. Everything looked ordinary. That was the strange thing about betrayal. The world never paused for it. The sun still shined. The birds still sang. The neighbors still waved as they watered their lawns. Only the person living through it could feel the shift beneath the surface. Around 5 o'clock, Mark arrived. Home from work. Jane heard his truck pull into the driveway and listened to the familiar sound of the garage door opening. For a brief moment, her heart softened. No matter how old a son became, a mother still remembered the little boy he once was. She remembered scraped knees, school projects spread across the dining room table, and long summer afternoons at the baseball field. Mark entered through the kitchen door, carrying his laptop bag. Emily greeted him immediately with a bright smile. Jane watched carefully as the two exchanged a quick glance. It lasted only a second. Most people would never have noticed it. Jane did. Something unspoken passed between them. A silent understanding. A private conversation without words. Mark walked into the living room and kissed his mother on the cheek. "How was your day, Mom?" he asked. Jane smiled gently. "Quiet," she replied. "I spent some time organizing old papers." The sentence was simple, but she noticed the way Emily suddenly stopped unloading the dishwasher. Just for a moment. Just long enough to hear. Then she resumed her task. Jane stored that reaction away in her memory. During dinner, the conversation stayed comfortably shallow. Mark talked about a new client. Emily mentioned a fundraiser she planned to attend the following weekend. Jane listened more than she spoke. The less she said, the more she learned. Several times, she noticed Emily steering conversations away from finances whenever they came close to the subject. If Mark mentioned bills, investments, or future plans, Emily redirected the discussion within seconds. It was subtle, smooth, practiced. By the time dessert was served, Jane felt more certain than ever that something important was being hidden. Later that evening, after Mark and Emily went upstairs, Jane remained in the living room alone. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily. She picked up her reading glasses and opened a small notebook she kept inside the drawer of an end table. It was not a dramatic gesture, just a simple notebook with a blue cover. Jane began writing dates, observations, small details, the missing receipts, the unexplained transactions, the unusual reactions. Whenever certain topics appeared, she was not building accusations. She was collecting facts. There was a difference. Her late husband had always told her that emotions could cloud judgment, but facts rarely did. As she wrote, another memory surfaced. 3 months earlier, she had received a bank notification about a transfer she did not recognize. Emily had explained it away quickly. At the time, Jane accepted the explanation because she trusted family. Now she wondered whether trust had blinded her. The realization hurt more than she expected. Not because of the money. Money could be replaced. Trust could not. Near midnight, Jane closed the notebook and looked around the darkened room. Family photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace. Birthdays, holidays, graduations, smiling faces frozen in happier moments. She wondered how many cracks had already existed behind those smiles. How many things she had overlooked because she wanted peace. The house settled quietly around her as the air conditioning hummed through the vents. Jane stood, turned off the lamp beside her chair, and headed toward her bedroom. Halfway up the stairs, she paused. A faint light glowed beneath the door of Mark and Emily's room. Voices drifted through the hallway. Too soft to understand. Too careful to trust. Jane continued upstairs without making a sound. For the first time in a long time, she was no longer asking whether something was wrong. She already knew it was. The only question now was how deep the deception went. The next morning arrived with a gray sky and a steady drizzle tapping against the windows. Jane woke earlier than usual. She sat at the small breakfast table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her and stared at the notebook she had started the night before. The blue cover looked ordinary, harmless, yet inside it were pieces of a puzzle that had begun forming a picture she did not like. By 8 o'clock, Mark had already left for work. Emily came downstairs 20 minutes later wearing a cream-colored sweater and carrying her phone. She smiled when she saw Jane. It was the same smile she had worn for years. Friendly, polished, predictable. "Good morning, Emily," said cheerfully. "You are up early." Jane returned the smile. Could not sleep. Emily poured herself coffee and sat across from her. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Rain slid down the kitchen window in long silver lines. The silence felt heavier than usual. Then Emily glanced toward the stack of mail sitting on the counter. Her eyes lingered there for only a second. Jane noticed. Emily quickly looked away and changed the subject. The reaction was small, but it stayed with Jane all day. Later that afternoon, while organizing old documents in a hallway cabinet, Jane found something she had completely forgotten about. It was a folder containing account summaries from the previous year. She carried it to the dining room table and began reading. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Utility bills, insurance statements, tax records. Then she noticed a transfer authorization form. The signature looked like hers. Almost. Jane adjusted her glasses and studied it carefully. Something felt wrong. The letters matched her handwriting style, but the pressure and spacing were different. It was like looking at a photograph that had been slightly altered. Familiar, but not quite right. Her pulse quickened. She compared it with several other documents. The difference became impossible to ignore. Jane sat back in her chair and stared at the form. The room suddenly felt colder. She remembered the week the document had supposedly been signed. She had been recovering from a severe flu and had barely left her bedroom. She certainly had not visited the bank. Yet somehow the authorization existed. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of her phone. The caller identification displayed a familiar name. Sarah Whitmore. Jane smiled faintly. Sarah had been her closest friend for nearly 30 years. They met through a community charity event and remained close ever since. Jane answered immediately. Within minutes, she found herself sharing more than she originally intended. Not everything, just enough. Sarah listened carefully without interrupting. When Jane finally finished speaking, there was a long pause on the line. "Jane," Sarah said quietly, "I do not think you are imagining any of this." The simple sentence carried unexpected weight. For days, Jane had questioned her own instincts. Hearing someone else acknowledge her concerns felt strangely comforting. Sarah suggested meeting for lunch the following day. Jane agreed. After ending the call, she returned to the dining room table and continued reviewing the documents. Hours passed. Outside, the rain stopped and pale sunlight emerged through the clouds. By evening, she had identified 3 additional transactions she could not explain, each one connected to accounts Emily regularly helped manage. Alone, they might have seemed innocent. Together, they formed a pattern. Jane closed the folder and looked across the room. Family photographs decorated the far wall. In one picture, Emily stood beside Mark during their wedding reception, smiling with complete confidence. Jane remembered how happy she had been that day. She had welcomed Emily into the family without hesitation. She trusted her, perhaps too easily. A sudden realization settled over her. The money was not the heart of the problem. The deception was. The hidden conversations. The careful misdirection. The assumption that she would never notice. That night, as dinner approached, Jane slipped the authorization form back into its folder and returned everything exactly where she found it. She was not ready to reveal what she knew. Not yet. Emily entered the kitchen shortly afterward, humming softly as she prepared dinner. Her movements appeared relaxed, comfortable, unconcerned. Jane watched from the doorway, her expression calm. Emily believed the situation remained under control. Jane almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because for the first time, Jane was beginning to see the shape of the truth. And once she saw it clearly, there would be no way to pretend it did not exist. The following afternoon, Jane met Sarah at a small family-owned restaurant on the edge of town. The place had been there for decades. Red brick walls, wooden booths polished by years of use. A waitress who seemed to know every customer by name. Jane arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the window. Outside, the last traces of rain still clung to the sidewalks. She wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee and watched people pass by. By the time Sarah arrived, Jane had already rehearsed a dozen different versions of the conversation in her mind. None of them felt right. Sarah slid into the booth across from her and immediately noticed the tension in Jane's face. "You look tired," she said gently. Jane smiled faintly. "I think I finally understand why." For the next hour, Jane shared everything she had discovered. The unusual transfers, the questionable signatures, the missing records. Sarah listened carefully, asking practical questions instead of offering emotional reactions. It was one of the reasons their friendship had lasted so long. Sarah never rushed to conclusions. When Jane finished, Sarah folded her hands and looked directly at her. "Have you checked who benefits from those transactions?" Jane shook her head. "Not yet." Sarah nodded slowly. "That is where I would start." The suggestion stayed with Jane long after lunch ended. On her drive home, she found herself remembering another conversation from years earlier. Her late husband, Robert, had always been cautious with finances. He believed money revealed character, not because of how much people had, but because of how they handled responsibility. She could almost hear his voice now. Calm, practical, patient. Robert never accused people without proof. He gathered facts first. Jane realized she had inherited more of his habits than she ever appreciated. When she arrived home, the house was empty. Mark and Emily were both still at work. The silence felt welcome. Jane carried her purse into the study and sat down at Robert's old desk. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating tiny dust particles floating through the air. For a moment, she simply sat there, looking at the framed photograph beside the computer. Robert was smiling in the picture, standing beside a fishing boat during a family vacation nearly 15 years earlier. Mark had been beside him, still young enough to think his father knew everything. Jane touched the frame lightly before turning her attention to the paperwork. Hours passed as she reviewed statements and records. The deeper she looked, the more patterns emerged. Certain transfers appeared shortly before major purchases. Certain account changes seemed connected to decisions Emily had encouraged. None of it proved wrongdoing by itself. Yet the connections continued appearing, one after another, like stepping stones across a river. Jane wrote everything down in her blue notebook. Dates, amounts, observations, questions. She remained careful not to let suspicion become certainty. Facts first, conclusions later. As evening approached, she heard a car pull into the driveway. Emily arrived home alone. Through the study window, Jane watched her carry shopping bags into the house. There was nothing unusual about it. Yet Jane noticed something she had overlooked before. Emily looked relieved when she believed nobody was watching. The polished public smile disappeared. Her shoulders relaxed. Her expression changed completely. It lasted only a few seconds before she entered the house. Jane closed the notebook slowly. That brief glimpse unsettled her more than any document. It felt like seeing the edge of a mask slip. During dinner, Emily spoke enthusiastically about future plans. Home improvements, weekend trips, financial goals. Mark listened attentively. Jane listened too, but this time she noticed something different. Emily frequently used the word "we" when discussing decisions involving money. Yet many of those decisions seemed to benefit her interests more than anyone else's. The realization settled heavily in Jane's mind. Later that night, after everyone had gone upstairs, Jane returned to the study. She opened the notebook and added one final sentence beneath her notes. The truth is hiding in plain sight. Then she closed the cover and stared into the darkness beyond the window. For the first time, she felt certain that someone in this house had been counting on her never looking closely. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption had been. 2 days later, an unexpected opportunity arrived. Jane was sorting through a box of old household records in the garage when her phone rang. The caller identification displayed a name she had not seen in months. Melissa Grant. Melissa had worked as an administrative assistant for Robert's accounting firm years ago before retiring. She and Jane occasionally exchanged holiday cards, but they rarely spoke. Jane answered with a warm greeting. Within minutes, the conversation took an unusual turn. Melissa mentioned running into a former banking manager at a community event the previous weekend. During their conversation, Jane's name had come up. Nothing confidential had been discussed, but Melissa casually mentioned that the manager seemed surprised to learn Jane was personally reviewing her finances these days. That single comment immediately caught Jane's attention. Why would that surprise him? Jane asked. Melissa hesitated. I assumed he thought someone else handled everything for you. After ending the call, Jane sat quietly for several minutes. The statement echoed in her mind. Someone else handled everything for you. The words felt harmless on the surface, yet they opened an entirely new line of questions. Who exactly believed they were managing her affairs? And how had that impression been created? That afternoon, Jane decided to visit the bank herself. She did not announce her plans. She simply drove across town and requested copies of several account records. The young representative assisting her was polite and professional. After reviewing the files, he excused himself briefly and returned with a supervisor. The supervisor greeted Jane warmly, but seemed mildly confused. Mrs. Collins, he said, we normally coordinate these requests through the authorized contact. Jane felt a chill move through her chest. Her expression remained calm. Authorized contact? She repeated. The supervisor turned the screen slightly toward her. There it was. A name listed on multiple account documents. Emily Collins. Jane stared at the screen without speaking. The supervisor immediately sensed something was wrong. He carefully explained that the authorization appeared to have been established months earlier through documentation already on file. Jane thanked him politely and requested copies of every related record. By the time she returned home, the late afternoon sun was hanging low above the neighborhood rooftops. She carried the folder into the study and placed it beside her blue notebook. Then she began reading. Page after page revealed a disturbing pattern. Emily had gradually positioned herself as the primary contact for matters Jane believed she still controlled personally. Some changes appeared minor. Others were far more significant. Yet each adjustment shared one common feature. Jane had no memory of approving them. As evening approached, she heard Mark and Emily arrive home. Their voices drifted through the hallway while she remained seated behind the closed study door. For the first time, Jane felt something deeper than suspicion. She felt disappointment. Not sharp anger. Not outrage. Just a quiet sadness. She remembered welcoming Emily into the family. She remembered helping pay for wedding expenses. She remembered holidays, birthdays, and countless dinners shared around the same table. Trust had been given freely. That was what made betrayal so difficult to recognize. It rarely arrived wearing a warning sign. It arrived wearing a smile. During dinner, Emily seemed unusually cheerful. She talked about future investments and long-term planning. Several times, she mentioned how important it was for families to support one another. Jane listened carefully. Every word felt different now. Not because the words themselves had changed, but because Jane finally understood the distance between what was being said and what was actually happening. Later that night, after the house grew quiet, Jane opened her notebook and added several new pages of observations. Then she placed the bank documents neatly beside it. The evidence was no longer made up of isolated incidents. A pattern was emerging, a deliberate one, and somewhere beneath all those signatures, transfers, and permissions was the answer she had been searching for. Emily had not simply benefited from Jane's trust. She had built an entire system around it. The question was no longer whether the truth existed. The question was how much of it remained hidden. The next morning, Jane woke with a sense of purpose she had not felt in weeks. She brewed a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen, and sat at the table with her notebook and the stack of documents she had gathered. Each page seemed heavier than the last, not because of the paper, but because of the weight of realization. Jane reviewed the account records again, checking names, dates, and amounts. She did not rush. Every detail mattered. She noted patterns, discrepancies, and repeated transfers, her mind organizing the evidence with careful precision. Outside, the sunlight slanted across the lawn, illuminating the droplets from last night's rain. The neighborhood was waking slowly. Birds chirped from the maple tree at the corner. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started, its distant hum a reminder of the ordinary world continuing unaware of the quiet investigations inside her home. Jane marked each item carefully in her notebook. She listed the transactions Emily had authorized, noting the times when she had been absent or unwell, the moments when her trust had been assumed without question. Jane allowed herself a small, calm smile. Understanding did not require anger, and preparation did not require haste. She had spent years cultivating patience. She would need it now. By late morning, Mark arrived home carrying a briefcase and a folder of documents. Jane greeted him with a gentle nod. "Morning, Mom," he said, setting his things down. "Busy day?" Jane simply shook her head. She did not speak about the records yet. She observed. She watched him organize the papers, noting how Emily's handwriting appeared on some forms, how certain pages seemed added after the fact. Everything was quiet. Everything was ordinary. And yet, Jane saw clearly. She could trace the steps of manipulation without ever confronting anyone. She wrote notes in the margins of her notebook, drawing connections, formulating questions she would ask later. Emily entered the kitchen with a basket of laundry. Her movements were smooth, casual, as though she were unaware that someone was watching closely. Jane held her gaze for a moment, seeing nothing outwardly incriminating, only the practiced ease of someone confident in their narrative. Later that afternoon, Jane went through old family photos, each one a memory of shared trust, laughter, and care. Birthdays, holidays, small celebrations. She thought about how Emily had integrated herself seamlessly, the subtle ways she had gained influence over finances and decisions. It was not reckless. It was careful, thoughtful, deliberate. Jane appreciated the strategy while recognizing its purpose. She had been underestimated. She would not make that mistake again. The sun began to set, casting long shadows through the house. Jane closed the blinds and set the notebook and documents neatly on the desk. She moved silently through the house, turning off lights and adjusting small details to her liking. Everything appeared normal. Everyone assumed the day had ended routinely. Jane allowed herself a moment to pause in the hallway and look back at the study where the evidence lay. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. Patience, observation, preparation. Each was a weapon in her own right. She would act when the moment was right, with careful precision. And until that time came, she would remain calm, controlled, fully aware of the patterns she had uncovered and the extent of the deception. The house was quiet, ordinary, unremarkable to anyone else. But Jane knew the truth, and knowing was enough to start planning. The following morning, Jane awoke to the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the soft light filtering through the bedroom curtains. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat at the small writing desk near the window, her blue notebook and the stack of documents from the previous days spread neatly before her. Each page contained a record, an observation, a pattern that she had begun to see more clearly with each passing day. She did not rush. Instead, she allowed herself to consider the implications of what she had discovered. The house was still, filled only with the occasional creak of settling floorboards and the faint rustle of leaves outside. Jane noted the precise times of the transactions she had flagged, the sequence of events, and the moments when Emily's presence coincided with discrepancies in the household accounts. She wrote carefully, connecting dots without forcing conclusions, letting the evidence speak for itself. Later, while preparing breakfast, Jane observed Emily moving around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, arranging dishes and checking the refrigerator. Every gesture was deliberate, every glance calculated. Jane did not comment. She simply watched, her mind cataloging the behavior, storing each detail. Mark joined her for breakfast, carrying his briefcase and greeting her with a brief, polite nod. Jane acknowledged him with a small smile and continued her observations silently. Conversation remained light, focused on mundane topics such as the weather and neighborhood news. Jane noted how Emily carefully redirected any mention of bills or accounts back to neutral subjects, always maintaining a polite, calm demeanor. By mid-morning, Jane had organized her notes and cross-referenced the financial records once more. Patterns emerged more clearly than before. She noticed which transfers Emily had managed directly, which had involved her approval without explicit confirmation, and which had been executed in such a way as to obscure the trail. None of it proved wrongdoing on its own, but together, the records indicated a strategy that had been quietly implemented over time. In the early afternoon, Jane retreated to the study with her notebook, a pen, and a cup of tea. Sunlight spilled across the desk, highlighting the neat rows of handwriting and the small post-it notes marking key dates. She allowed herself a moment to reflect on past holidays, birthdays, and family gatherings, remembering the warmth and trust she had placed in the household, and the ease with which that trust had been taken for granted. She did not dwell on anger. Instead, she focused on clarity. Every observation, every document, every small interaction would contribute to her understanding. By late afternoon, Jane had mapped a timeline of events, noting precisely when certain decisions had been made, when communications had occurred, and when financial adjustments had been implemented. She organized her findings methodically, ensuring that each piece of evidence was accounted for and properly documented. When the evening arrived, Mark and Emily returned home, chatting softly. As they entered the kitchen, Jane listened without speaking, noting the subtle cues in tone, posture, and eye movement that might reveal the underlying intentions behind their actions. She observed Emily's gestures and expressions, cataloging each as part of a larger picture. Later that night, after the house had quieted and everyone had retired to their rooms, Jane reviewed her notes once more. The patterns were now undeniable. There was a clear chain of events, a deliberate sequence that had shaped the household in ways she had only just begun to comprehend. Jane closed her notebook slowly, placing the documents neatly in a folder. She stood and moved quietly to the window, looking out at the moonlit street, allowing herself a moment of stillness. She was no longer questioning what had occurred. She understood, and with understanding came a quiet determination. The next steps would be careful, deliberate, and precise, executed with the same patience and attention to detail that had guided her through years of family life, and now through the discovery of the truth. The following morning, Jane awoke with a renewed sense of focus. She moved quietly through the house, observing small details as she had done for days, noting the arrangement of papers on the kitchen counter, the positioning of Emily's coffee cup, the subtle shifts in posture and expression that might hint at intent. Breakfast was calm and ordinary on the surface, yet Jane absorbed every movement, every inflection, every glance exchanged between Mark and Emily. She continued her review of documents, cross-referencing dates, amounts, and approvals, each line building a map of activity that had been hidden from her for months. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes drifting lazily in the air. Jane paused to trace her fingers over a family photograph on the mantel. Mark and Emily's smiles had always appeared perfect in photos, frozen moments of happiness she had once trusted completely. Now, she considered the context behind each expression, the timing of actions, the decisions that had quietly shifted control. By mid-morning, Jane compiled a list of questions, uncertainties, and observations. She noted when certain accounts were accessed, when transfers occurred, and how responsibilities had subtly been assumed by Emily over time. Each point added clarity, forming a framework she could understand and eventually act upon. In the afternoon, she stepped outside briefly, inhaling the cool, crisp air and feeling the grass damp beneath her feet from overnight rain. The neighborhood was serene, children playing at a distance, neighbors tending to their gardens, all unaware of the careful planning unfolding inside Jane's home. Returning indoors, she revisited the blue notebook, reorganizing entries, making connections, and highlighting patterns. It was methodical, deliberate, and precise, yet entirely calm. Jane's eyes lingered on the clock. Time moved slowly when one was patient, deliberately so when observing the world. Mark arrived home later than usual, his footsteps quiet as he entered. Jane greeted him with a subtle nod and a smile, noting the ease with which he assumed the household was functioning as expected. Emily followed, carrying grocery bags and chatting about minor errands and neighborhood events. Jane listened intently, noting how Emily directed the conversation away from financial matters and how quickly any sensitive topic was deflected. Dinner was routine, conversationally pleasant, yet Jane cataloged each interaction, each nuance. Later that evening, when the house was still and the lights dimmed, Jane opened the notebook once more, reviewing all observations and cross-checking facts. The pattern she had been piecing together over days now appeared coherent. A network of deliberate actions and subtle manipulations was evident, but Jane remained composed. She placed the documents carefully beside her notebook and stepped back, considering her next moves. The quiet of the house, the ordinary sounds of settling furniture and the hum of the refrigerator contrasted with the growing clarity of the situation in her mind. Jane felt a calm, quiet determination. She was ready to act, but only when the timing and approach were exactly right. The evidence was thorough, the understanding complete, and the patience she had cultivated over a lifetime would guide every next step. For the first time in weeks, Jane allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of triumph yet, but of quiet anticipation, knowing that awareness and preparation had shifted the balance, and that the household she had trusted so implicitly was now fully within her perceptive grasp. By the following morning, Jane felt an unusual sense of clarity. She moved through the house with deliberate calm, taking note of small details, the slight tilt of a picture frame, the placement of keys on the counter, the way sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor. Each observation added to the picture she had been assembling in her mind. Breakfast was quiet. Mark glanced at her occasionally, offering brief conversation about work and neighborhood events, while Emily focused on clearing the dishes and preparing for the day ahead. Jane noted everything. Each glance, each pause, each word exchanged contributed to a subtle understanding of the household dynamics she had long taken for granted. She reviewed her notebook once again, carefully tracing the chain of events and aligning the patterns she had uncovered over the past several days. Every document, every minor interaction, every small discrepancy in behavior now formed a coherent narrative. Jane realized that her patience had provided her with the insight she needed to approach the situation with clarity and composure. She spent the morning reviewing the evidence, making marginal notes, and organizing the records so that the sequence of events could be communicated precisely when the moment arrived. By afternoon, Jane allowed herself a brief pause, gazing out the window at the quiet street, noticing children riding bikes, neighbors walking dogs, and the ordinary rhythms of a neighborhood oblivious to the careful observations unfolding inside her home. She sipped her tea, thoughtful, considering the timing and method of addressing the subtle manipulations she had uncovered. She did not feel anger. She felt focus. The house remained calm around her, yet Jane understood the shift that had taken place. The confidence she had granted freely in the past had been quietly exploited, but she now held the knowledge to restore balance. As evening approached, Mark and Emily returned home, their conversation light and routine. Jane observed the subtle cues in posture, tone, and timing, cataloging each as part of a comprehensive understanding she had built over the preceding days. Dinner passed without incident, and the house settled into its nightly rhythm. After the family retired to their rooms, Jane remained in the study, reviewing the notes and documents one final time. Each page reinforced the clarity she had achieved. She set the records neatly on the desk and allowed herself a small, composed smile. She no longer needed to rush. The understanding she had gained was sufficient. The next steps would be deliberate and precise. She closed the notebook and looked out the window into the moonlit yard, the quiet suburban street bathed in silver light. She felt steady, prepared, and for the first time in weeks, completely in control. The house appeared ordinary to any observer, yet Jane knew it held the evidence, the clarity, and the potential for change. The truth had been uncovered. The course of action had been considered, and the household, once subtly influenced, would now feel the quiet weight of awareness. Jane turned from the window, leaving the desk orderly, the documents secure, and herself calm, ready for the next chapter, knowing that patience, observation, and understanding had shifted everything in her favor.